All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Ashley Rumschlag, and I am the CEO and president of domesticshelters.org and Teresa's Fund. I'm also joined by Rachel Myers, our digital services specialist, and Hannah Craig, our senior content strategist and creator, who will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A box today throughout the presentation. We are excited to have such a knowledgeable panel of experts joining us today once again to discuss the role of the 911 telecommunicator and PSAPs in the criminal justice system. And I'll introduce them shortly. This webinar is part 2 of our webinar series in partnership with Bodyguard. To watch the first webinar, please visit our webinar archive on domesticshelters.org. And Rachel will drop a link to that in the chat at some point in the presentation. But before we get started, let's go over just a few housekeeping items. All right. So closed captionings are available for the webinar. To enable, please click More in the menu bar and select Show Subtitles. A transcript will also be available within a week of the presentation. And I know we're also familiar with Zoom, but just a few things to mention. In a webinar, you are in listen-only mode. And please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. That's where we'll be reviewing and organizing questions. But if you have things you'd like to say directly to other participants or hosts of the webinar, please put those in the chat box. Okay, and then one more reminder that we do send out a certificate, that transcript, a webinar recording, and all additional resources. If anything's mentioned throughout the presentation, we'll send those out in an email within a week of the presentation. So if you are a call-in listener, don't forget to send us an email to info@domesticshelters.org. Just let us know that you're here and we'll take note of your email address and send you the materials there. And then we have another webinar coming up at the end of the month called Why Family Courts Fail, Productive Mothers and Their Children, 20 Common Mistakes and Evaluations Judges Miss. So this is going to focus on child custody and the family court system with Barry Goldstein and Veronica York. That is Thursday, March 31st, same time as this webinar, so 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And have you submitted your Purple Ribbon Awards nominations yet? So we are coming in on the deadline for the Purple Ribbon Awards nomination period that ends at the end of the month, so March 31st. If you have not yet, please go ahead and go to purpleribbon.awards.org for your chance to win up to a share of $30,000 in grants. The nomination process is quick and easy. We just ask for a short description of the nomination, and then any supporting materials can be attached. Winners will receive Purple Ribbon Award medallions. I've brought one here today. Here's the medallions that we send out. They receive a certificate and then will also be featured in a virtual awards program in September, as well as on domesticshelters.org. Rachel will drop a link to the chat for that as well, so you can take a look. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at info@domesticshelters.org. All right. A huge thank you to Bodyguard for partnering with us on this webinar. It would not be possible without their help to get all the panelists together and to really just hone in on the information that needs to be shared with domestic violence professionals like yourself. So Bodyguard, just a little bit, has created a unique proprietary technology to reduce barriers so everyone can reach 911 and be supported before and after a crime has been committed. Every individual deserves the right to primal safety, and this is the core of the work that they're doing. Since Bodyguard does not rely on cell towers, which may have dead zones for emergency communication, they are able to provide access to 911 using GPS technology when help is needed. This is really good timing for this webinar today because they have just released the new feature, which is the safety card. So the app is now in the App Store and does include the safety card. So people who use the eBodyguard app to connect with the nearest 911 call center will not only share their location data, but they'll also be sharing critical information about their medical history, information about family members, and details about people who might want to harm them, including protection orders. So that last two pieces are information that is critical, of course, for victims and survivors of domestic violence, and just really helps them to feel heard. So you'll see the screen here with the images of the sometimes I'm afraid of information, protection orders, and then they also have, obviously, here's the screen where you call for help, vehicle information, and family members. So there's some of the information that's collected and shared with the safety card. And so like I said, it's a perfect timing with this conversation because this information really solves a major problem for 911 telecommunicators. All this information gives 911 telecommunicators law enforcement a clear picture of what is happening, how they need to respond, even if it's the first time the caller's called in that jurisdiction, or if the caller doesn't even say anything. All of this information is available to the telecommunicators and without a court order. This image here is what the computer-aided dispatch screen shows. So it shows the user's location and a link in the bottom left. You see the outlined box. So that's what the telecommunicator clicks when the safety card information is available, and then it takes them to this screen here. So this image shows how the safety card information is displayed to the telecommunicator. So we are just so proud to partner with eBodyguard for this series of webinars, but also to get the word out about eBodyguard and this life-saving technology. We'll send an email separately within probably the next week that just shares more information about the tool. And we encourage you to reach out to them. Their phone number, they have a hotline you can reach out to, as well as an email address that if you would like to connect with them and just to make sure that your PSAP, so your 911 call center, is ready to accept this new information. So we'll leave that up here on the screen if you'd like to reach out. And also just to mention, their CEO and founder, Melissa Faithart, is on the call today. And if the opportunity arises, she will come in and kind of provide some additional context to the conversation today. So thank you, Melissa, for joining. Okay, so today, like I mentioned, we're going to focus on what's considered the gateway to the criminal justice system. So that's the 911 centers. We'll talk about just how important the first 5 minutes of a 911 interaction are to ensuring the safety of victims and swift justice for the victim. And with that, we'll hear a lot from Heather Joyner, who is the Assistant Communications Director at Franklin County Emergency Communications in Lewisburg, North Carolina. We'll also hear once again from domestic violence expert Rita Smith, retired police chief John Jackson, and former prosecutor Matthew Durkin. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and we'll welcome Heather Joyner.
Hi, Ashley.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here today. I did want to just start off with one piece of information that I know we shared last time, but it's important to mention. We say the word PSAP a lot. So PSAP is an acronym. Could you share what that stands for?
Yeah, it stands for Public Safety Answering Point. So every county, has a PSAP, or also known as 911 center, basically. Yeah. So Public Safety Answering Point is what PSAP is.
Awesome. Thanks so much for starting in with that. I know there's all these new terminology, so I just make sure everyone's on the same page before we dive in. And I think the first question I'd like to start with is, can you kind of describe how the industry has transitioned from, I know the term dispatcher might be something that people are more familiar with hearing, but now it's more, using the term 911 telecommunicator. Can you talk about that transition?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you foremost for allowing 911 to have a voice. We're always behind the scenes, so it's nice to be able to be included in this. But the first 911 call in the United States was made in Haleyville, Alabama, and it was on February the 16th of 1968. And that was considered a basic 911 setup, where you had one person from point A contacting a person from point B through telephone, but no data exchange. So over the years, dispatcher became from receiving a call and dispatching appropriate responder. Well, we have since transitioned from basic. We went from basic to enhanced to wireless phase 1, phase 2. Now we're in a next generation 911 era. And next generation 911 era is including all the data exchange that can come into a 911 center. Now we have smartphones and cell phone technology with applications such as Bodyguard safety card. And so dispatcher became just dispatching without any information other than just where to go. Truck companies, taxi drivers, transportation services, those are what we would consider dispatching because they're dispatching point A to point B. 911 public safety telecommunications came in effect because over time with technology and growth, there are expectations. And so when people call 911, they don't want to be told, well, I don't know what to tell you. They want help. And so we know that we're answering medical calls of service, we're answering law enforcement response calls of service, and fire response. So telecommunicators have to have that training to be able to give pre-arrival medical instructions as well as safety instructions to callers, which enhance the term public safety telecommunicator. So we do more than just answer the phone and type in a computer and dispatch a unit. We're taking the call, we're processing the data. We are basically the eyes and ears and information gathering point to give our responders as much information as possible for their safe approach.
Very good. So essentially, I mean, I know that we talked about this kind of in our preparation for today's webinar. We talked about how many states are now considering 911 telecommunicators as first responders, as they really should be. So it sounds as though that's, I mean, a new classification that kind of helps to really frame the importance and the gravity of what they're doing.
Yeah, very, very true. Many states are already kind of locally adopting, that, but we have many more to go. But basically, it is recognizing us from being clerical administrative support staff into being an extension of the criminal justice public safety response. So it is a huge, respect, and it's also a huge, benefit to have those services to telecommunicators as law enforcement and medical and fire, service response.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of said this term that, 911 center is the gateway to the criminal justice system. Can you just talk more about that and why that's kind of the consideration of why things start with 911?
Yeah, pretty much 94.8% of calls are initiated through a call to 911. And so the others are initiated through people walking up or initiating that with law enforcement or fire or medical, and then others are officer initiated. So about, the percentage of calls that are coming in are started by someone having an emergency and calling 911, which is the national recognized number for help, basically. And so when the call comes in, every 911 center has recording software that is recording telephone calls of service, as well as radio communications and interactions between the responders and the telecommunicator. And so the first 5 minutes, of the application here is the recordings that are coming into the center is evidence. It can be used as evidence to support certain cases and things like that. So we are taking the information, we are obtaining the data. We are the command center for getting everything that we need to be able to get our responders to where they need to be in a safe manner.
Right. Yeah, wow, that's a really big number. You kind of assume, that's kind of the first place people go, but you would think that there would be more, officer initiated or, people coming in off the street. So that's a lot of the calls. That's the vast majority. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yes.
Can you describe how telecommunicators are trained in the manner they respond to calls? So specifically tone of voice and demeanor.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's always a professional standard that we look for in customer service. And, because we are the bridge between the community and getting the response of a need that they have for medical, fire, or law enforcement. And so training will vary across states. It will vary based on locations and each individual PSAP as well. Some states require what we consider like state recognized certifications for emergency medical dispatch, police dispatch, fire dispatch. Some of the smaller counties may not have state regulated standard, but they have local regulated standard for training and continuing education that's required with all of these certifications that are obtained. Telecommunicators typically respond to about anywhere from 58 to about 72 hours per year just in training of trying to stay abreast of the latest and greatest in technology and growth, community, public relations and things like that. So there's always exposure and there's always that training that has to accommodate the performance. So with emergency medical dispatch, it's giving telecommunicators a skill set to give pre-arrival instructions to callers who are having a medical emergency. For those that are experiencing a fire or some type of fire hazard, safety, that they're able to be certified to give information and respond to questions based on the protocols that they have. As far as tone of voice and demeanor, that's just interpersonal communication skills that we train. It's very hard when you are choosing to be in a role that you're constantly dealing with emergencies. This is not a profession where people call you to say thank you or have a great day. This is where you're dealing with people in their most critical, vulnerable moments of life. And so we have to ensure mental health wellness. We have to ensure that our individuals who are employed processing through all these calls have time that they can be away from the work to have some downtime to basically be supported so they can have that right demeanor and tone when they're speaking to callers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always impressed. You'll hear 911 playbacks when there's a crime or, some sort of, really a lot of like crime shows, things like that. You hear them play back and I'm always just so impressed with the calmness that's in their voice. So obviously, like you said, there's a lot of training that goes into that because that's not something you just pick up on day one. You have to be able to stay focused and make sure that you're providing quick and accurate service.
Yeah, because if we're not able to take a breath and be that calm in the storm, can you imagine if a telecommunicator was emotional trying to dispatch units?
Right.
That would create a ripple effect of responders responding in a different manner as well, based on the tone or demeanor of a telecommunicator. So we are basically the point to help de-escalate situations that we can actually listen and acknowledge a person's pain and what they're experiencing, just to be able to focus on the need, not their behavior.
Right. Absolutely. It's a non-judgment zone too, because you have to really accept the idea that you don't know how you would act in that situation yourself. So you have a lot of that going in. So we kind of touched on this whole idea of self-care and compassion fatigue, but how can PSAP managers help telecommunicators with compassion fatigue, specifically with repeat domestic violence calls? Because you're hearing similar, same people calling back for maybe similar incidences or more escalated incidences. How do you manage that? How do you encourage people to continue to provide, the level of service that they need?
Well, in our case here in our center, it is about training. It is about partnering with your community partners, such as the shelter advocates that we have here, such as, Safe Space is our local one. Training and awareness. If we can be aware and non-judgmental, like you said before, which can be very challenging at times when you have repeat, individuals that are calling about some similar incident. And it's very easy to get in that judgment zone of why don't they just do this or why can't this just happen? In reality, it's a lot more in depth than just an opinion of what you would do in that situation. So we know there's a lot more engaged in that. So what we try to do is just increase the level of awareness. We do have quality assurance to, review our calls to make certain that we're not crossing boundaries when it comes to that. And also, again, just the training of being able to set the standard and expectation of how we're going to process calls, how we're going to work in the training with our community advocates, and just educate not only the community, but also our staff and how we're dealing with those calls for service.
Yeah. And what are some of the most time consuming actions that are required by telecommunicators? Because obviously we talk about the first 5 minutes as every second counts when you're talking to someone in an emergency. What are some of those time consuming things that could be reduced to speed up the process?
Oh, Ashley, that is a great question. Let me just share this. The most time consuming is trying to figure out where a person is. What typically happens is we have about 240 million calls across the United States in a year that typically happens. And I'll put the link to where I'm getting and quoting all these stats. So out of 240 million calls that are taking place across the United States, 80% of those calls are coming in through wireless devices, meaning from tablets or smartphones, cell phones is how they're coming in. And the GPS, as far as latitude and longitude using cell phone technology, it's not always accurate. And we're challenged, especially when you live in areas where you have interstates and airports where you have people coming in that are not local and not really sure where they are. It's very time consuming to try to pinpoint exactly where the person is. The second challenge is, what is happening? Because in some situations you get silent calls or you get calls where you hear distress in the background, but you don't really know what's going on to know the appropriate response that you may need to send. So sometimes we may send law enforcement in to identify what that need is. And then if medical and fire or first responders are needed, then we can do that at the request of law enforcement after they've identified the need. So the two top challenges that are really time consuming is number one, trying to locate people. Number two, trying to determine what's happening to get our officers or responders into a situation that they can be strategic to approach if it is a violent or an escalated situation. So those I would say would be the top two challenges.
Yeah. One last question for you. If you could change or improve anything about the 911 system and technology, what would it be?
You got some really good questions today,
I feel like I'm opening up these cans of worms here with you.
Yeah, but you're also allowing a platform to educate and to share. The top challenges that we face, and this is not just here in North Carolina, it is a national problem that is everywhere, is we're working in siloed systems. We're working in systems that don't communicate or integrate effectively with one another. And so everything that I may have in my system may not transfer to the law enforcement's database or may not transfer to medical databases. So we're all working in our own systems of infrastructure, and that creates some huge disadvantages. So for me in my career, what I really hope to see accomplished is the fact that we are able to have a single line of communication that is across the board that can ensure that we're collecting all the data and all the agencies can work together and supporting each other of understanding, this information and how we can use it to the best of our abilities, especially when there are crimes that are occurring.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, this is really great information, and we'll hear from you later as well throughout the more general Q&A. But thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone that we have set aside time for Q&A at the end. We're going to try and carve out at least 30, hopefully 40 minutes. So please be sure to ask the questions that are on your mind now in the Q&A box. And then at the end, we'll go ahead and answer all of the questions. But next, let's hear from John Jackson, who is a longtime law enforcement officer and former chief of police in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Great to see you, John. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you here, Ashley, and I'm thrilled we get to do this again together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's start off with a question. We're going to try and hopefully understand maybe misconceptions or just kind of how how law enforcement interacts with 911. So hopefully these questions will kind of guide us in that conversation. But let's start off with, with 911 as the gateway to the criminal justice system. How can they provide you with better information and help you gather the evidence required for charging from the very beginning?
Well, I think what we have to understand is that at the 911 call, it really is the start of the process for charging as you've described it. The safety card is a really good first step. It's innovative. It's in your hand all the time. And we all have these cell phones, and it's literally the definition of working smarter rather than trying to find a landline phone. That said, what officers need is good information to make good decisions. They can't get to the scene and not know as much as they need to, and then do what they need to do, which is make good decisions in a timely manner. As Ashley, when Heather said calm is important, calm wins the day. And the dispatcher or 911 technician, what they're doing is they're balancing both sides. A person who desperately needs help in a crisis versus helping law enforcement get there to solve that crisis. The details really matter. Things like the kids on scene, pets, alcohol, drug use, weapons. It's all things that start the process of getting officers or public safety people on the scene to deal with the problem. The fact that Heather said and spoke about training, it's critical. Training those 911 technicians to specifically ask the right questions that are directly connected to what the officers or deputies are responding to becomes critical. We know that 911 calls are at the very start of what I will call the e-discovery process, and we're just now beginning the ability to gather it as evidence, pull it into one package to then give a victim the opportunity at a successful prosecution. Gathering all of that key information will aid in the successful prosecution if that's the way it ends up. But what we're talking about here today is that 911 position sets everything up for a future win, and it is an incredibly difficult position to sit in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about staying calm and making good decisions, once the law enforcement officers are on scene. But there's also, we have to recognize how dangerous, domestic violence calls are for law enforcement officers. So it's not just a matter of making sure that, their response goes smoothly with that information, but it's also a matter of, in many cases, life or death. So there's seemingly a lot of important information that needs to be transferred.
Yes.
Is there something early on in your career, or maybe just even, more recently, that you misunderstood about how 911 telecommunicators operate and kind of their role and something you had to learn throughout your career?
Oh boy, that's an easy one for me. I never knew how hard the job was. They have to have and master different skill sets. They have to listen and they have to talk at the same time, and they're listening and talking for different things. I used to tell people the 911 center operators are the most important position in any police department because without them, nothing else happens. And I truly still believe that today. My law enforcement buddies are going to be mad at me for saying that, but it's not really the cops that are the most important. They like to act like they are, but they are not. It's those 911 operators who are gathering information. And we all know that at our heart. But what I remember going back is, it used to be we write notes down, and then we were writing notes from a landline call to get officers out there. Now with the advent and evolution of technology, it has been truly a game changer with everything. It's the attention to details and calm demeanor that wins the day. We keep talking about that. The difficulty of the position that I didn't know was that it really is a 24/7 love for the job. You're not doing that job for the pay. It is a 24/7 job where you're up there on Christmas morning to answer that call when someone needs you, even on Christmas morning. It is a dedicated field to help people that few people possess the skills to do. They're directly speaking with people in crisis, remaining calm. And I never knew how difficult it was to get that out to the field in an organized manner. To say that they're true first responders is an underestimation of the position, and they're in the hearts of every one of us that has worn a uniform.
Yeah. It's so great to see the respect that's there, because obviously, the criminal justice system is so connected. There's, you can't have one without the other. Each one has their own specific role. So it's great to see that you've been able to truly recognize the importance of supporting one another.
Yes.
If you had an opportunity to train a 911 telecommunicator, is there something, what would be the number one thing that you would train them to do?
The number one thing would be their communication skills. And I would tell them, I'd probably boil it down into 3 areas. I'd tell them to remain calm at all times. I would tell them to gather the important details. And I would tell them to get those details out to the field as quickly as you can. So it does really boil back to intercommunication and personal skills, but getting those 3 things done, if you want to be working the 911 seat, it would make you successful.
Yeah. Great information. Well, John, thank you so much. We'll bring you back here shortly once we've had a chance to speak with Matthew and Rita.
Sure.
But thank you so much. And with that, let's bring on Matthew Durkin. As a former district attorney, deputy attorney general, Matthew has been a tireless advocate for victims of homicide, physical and sexual abuse, and domestic violence. Thank you so much for being here today, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
Good morning, Ashley. It's great to be here, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. How did we not acknowledge that yet? Great. Well, let's go ahead and like I said, we're really trying to focus in on how each portion of the criminal justice system ties into the 911 system. So, if you could, we talk about 911 as the gateway to the criminal justice system. How can they provide you with better information and help you gather the evidence required for prosecution from the very beginning?
Well, I really echo really what John Jackson just said, and my appreciation goes out to all the 911 operators and employees out there. They really are at the tip of the spear, and I appreciate all of what Heather was talking about in terms of not just doing the job, but developing the job and trying to incorporate some innovation to improve it. And that's where Bodyguard is so critical in developing all of that information. In terms of what operators can do, 911 workers can do is perhaps just take a step back and understand just how significant that first seconds, minutes are. As John Jackson said, calm wins the day. And to keep the line open and keep that dialogue going, even when there is no dialogue. Because those first seconds and those first minutes are the entire case. That's the evidence that is going to be most impactful for a jury down the line. So to have that dialogue going in terms of just establishing who you are, who is there, what is happening, and even if those responses aren't necessarily what may be productive. For instance, maybe they're not even listening, but you might hear the emotion in the victim's voice. You might hear a child in the background. And sadly, we've had too many 911 calls where you might not hear the victim at all because something very significant is happening or has just happened. Even that silence is critical information and evidence for a jury to consider later on. I can tell you on several different homicide cases, I have played that 911 call where that silence is deafening. It really is. And it haunts me to this day. So just keeping that dialogue open, even when there's no dialogue. You capture evidence in the background. You might capture the perpetrator. You might capture witnesses in the background. Just keeping that dialogue going. And 911 operators are just so good at that.
Yeah, that's really important. I hadn't really thought about just all those little pieces of evidence that could be collected just by keeping the lines open and asking questions and just trying to paint a picture of what's happening in the moment. And really, like you said, that first second of that call, that's where the case starts and that's where you kind of build it from. Can you describe any situations that you've encountered where you've had challenges obtaining the needed evidence from the PSAP call or just in general from that department? And did it lead to difficulties in getting a prosecution?
Absolutely. It felt like almost in every case. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but that's why this conversation, these panels, and everything that Bodyguard is doing is so critical, because it may sound silly, but for years, my entire prosecution career, we would have difficulties just even getting the 911 call at all. And if we got it, it would be delayed. And as the case is progressing through the criminal justice system, those delays really affect our ability to be effective in terms of plea negotiations or understanding the case. And sometimes even leads to legal sanctions in the courtroom when we can't get those 911 calls quickly. Once we get those 911 calls, we get all that evidence and we capture the essence of that case, as I had previously described, and we can be more equipped to deal with the case effectively as we go along. And if that means a plea bargain is necessary, so be it. But more often than not, what that 911 call tells us is just how significant the case is, so that we can hold a tighter line and perhaps even go to trial. So it sounds so rudimentary, but simply getting that information to the prosecutor's file, whether that's digitally or a hard copy back in the day. That's what this whole conversation is so critical for, is to make sure that we build those bridges to make sure that evidence gets from that crime scene to that prosecutor's file so that we can be effective in court.
Yeah, very important. Is there something, I'll ask the same question that I asked to John, but is there something that maybe early on in your career or just throughout your career at some point that you realized that you misunderstood about the 911 telecommunicators role in the PSAPs?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because it makes me think. And I have to confess, for years and years, too many years as a prosecutor, I had really no appreciation for how critical 911 operators were and just how important they are. And, that's just my sin of being young and dumb. But I will tell you that really came to a screeching halt one day when I was doing a trial on a very, very serious case, and we had to call the 911 operator as a witness. And as I spoke with that 911 operator, I could tell that case really emotionally impacted her. Obviously, she was concerned about testifying. She wanted to do a good job, but that case really stood out in her mind and was haunting her as she was going up on the stand. And for the first time in my life, I had recognized that they are not only just critical, but that they're human beings, and just how significant their job is in trying to maintain that calm voice, to develop that information so that emergency responders can arrive on scene and, sadly, in this case, stop something before it becomes a homicide that didn't happen there. And just how emotional that is, and just how important that job is, and how difficult it is to maintain that professionalism and maintain those strategies to develop the information so that emergency responders can get there in the worst of circumstances. So it was in that moment that I completely did a 180 and understood for the first time 911 operators really deserve a ton of credit that they rarely receive. So thank you for all of what you do.
Yeah, I think it's that whole idea of being able to walk in each other's shoes and to see from their vantage point. So, that's a wonderful moment where, you kind of had that moment of clarity, and hopefully, I'm assuming, informed kind of the rest of your career moving forward. Everything that, yeah. One last question for you. If you had, let's see. Yeah, let's go to this one. So if you had an opportunity to train a group of 911 telecommunicators, could you just maybe the number one thing that you would make sure that they learned in that training?
Well, we have talked a little bit about just how multidimensional that this job is. And we've talked about emergency response, and that's absolutely critical, right? We need to get the information to the emergency responders so that they can understand and make the good decisions that John Jackson was talking about. But what I would stress to them is that at the very same time, this is the most important evidence that we may ever have. This is maybe our only option, our only chance to develop the information of who was there, what they were doing, and to develop that evidence for prosecution. It's not just the first step in law enforcement. It's not just the first step in emergency response. It's really the first step of prosecution. So not to put any greater weight or burden on 911 operators, but just to understand that every word, every sound, every act, everything that they are developing is really going to become very, very critical as pieces of evidence later on in a prosecution.
Yeah, that's really important. Just those kind of seemingly asking good questions and allowing that information to be recorded. Really important.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Matthew. We'll welcome you back here shortly. We're going to bring on Rita Smith. So Rita is a nationally recognized domestic violence expert and the former director of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She currently serves as a consultant to the NFL and works with domesticshelters.org as our VP of External Relations. So welcome, Rita. So great to see you. And thanks for joining us today.
You bet. I really enjoy being able to have conversations like this so that advocates get as much information as they can to do the best job they can in a time of crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of maybe leans into where we should start these questions, which is kind of in our pre-webinar preparation, we started to really open up this idea of how similar a 911 telecommunicators role is to a domestic violence hotline operator. There's certainly different resources available to both of them, but could you just speak to kind of where you see as the overlap of their roles and even the kind of the challenges that they face?
Yeah, you bet. I think that that's really similar is that both people are dealing with someone who's in crisis, who has something they need pretty quickly, and they're looking for help from the person on the other end of the line. So they're looking to you to help them solve what is sometimes an unsolvable problem. And that can be traumatic by itself. And so I think that one of the things that domestic violence advocates can understand a little better about the system that we work with in terms of responses to DV is that we have something really in common with that first responder, that first phone call that goes into the 911 system. We have more in common with them than we might think. And so building relationships and building bridges with those people who work in that 911 system might be a great way to cross-pollinate in terms of secondary trauma exercises and doing events with each other to really understand the kind of things that we face and the kind of calls that we take every day, so that we can help each other out in that process. And I think the other thing is that we're gathering really critical information that could be helpful to the criminal justice system. Now, as a domestic violence advocate, you have a confidentiality issue that you can't share without the help of the victim wanting to release that information. The 911 operator has a different process there. And that's why the safety card is so helpful. It's because a survivor or victim can put information into that app that they want the criminal justice system to know right away. They want them to be aware of right away. And once they use that app to instigate a call with 911, that information goes automatically there. Everything they want them to know is on that app. And that starts the process from a much better performed place than going through the telecommunicator, going through the person to try to relay that information secondhand to officers who are responding. They can say from the victim's own words, this is what they're afraid of. This is the person. This is what they've done in the past. This is the vehicle they're driving. This is what they look like. I mean, all that information is just right there for them from the victim's own words. So I think in some respects, those two pieces, while both are gathering confidential information, going into the 911 system allows them to provide information to those first responders that would take time to gather and then relay again. So it saves times, it gives information from the victim's own voice. And I think that's a real plus and will help improve safety.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. And just as you were talking, I was thinking about how interconnected a hotline operator at a shelter is to 911. Obviously domesticshelters.org, we try to connect people with resources in their time of need, but we don't operate a hotline. But we'll even find ourselves, in every email we say, if you're having an emergency, call 911. So, we kind of take for granted that number is going to be there and that the people on the other line are going to be trained and going to be able to help them. But, I think this is just a moment just to say, thank you to 911 operators for being there, because I have to imagine that, it's something that hotline operators rely on. If something does escalate to a crime is in progress, they get them to 911 as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I think looking to your local shelter, as Heather said, she works pretty closely with her local program there. They can come in and do training to help you better understand the kind of calls you're getting from domestic violence victims or sexual assault victims, if it's a dual program. So I think it can be a really helpful relationship to build in many ways. We understand better what the response is going to be as advocates when we tell people to call 911 if they're in danger. And then for the 911 operators and the telecommunicators to have better information about what's happening on the other end and what the victim is going through and what kinds of things can be helpful in terms of responding to them as they're in the middle of a crisis. So I think those things are really, the cross-pollination, again, like I said, can be really helpful in this system.
Yeah, absolutely. Those conversations kind of help to make sure that when they say, okay, call 911, they're going to get the best response. And that leads kind of to another question I have, which is, if you were to put on a training for 911 telecommunicators, what are some of the things that you would make sure to tell those telecommunicators?
Well, I think the first is to take every situation, even if it's a repeat, as that situation. What's happening now? What are the fears now? What is this person asking for help for? And not assuming that even if you've talked to this person before, not assuming that you understand what they're going through, not assuming that what the outcome is going to be. That our goal is to, every time we intercede, is to intercede in the way that makes that victim stronger, makes that victim more likely to be able to get away and stay away safely. And so every time we intercede from the place of, they've reached out to me, I'm their best option. I'm their best hope. I'm going to get them as many resources as I can in this moment in time to help them be successful, because they're reaching out because they don't want to live in the violence. But getting away from that violence is extraordinarily difficult. And they're connected to an abuser who is absolutely committed to them failing at that. And so we have to do everything we can, bring every resource we can to the table to make sure that this time they're as successful as they can be, and that we'll be there the next time if they call.
Yeah, really important we talked about at the beginning, the no judgment zone, to make sure that people go into it and take it as, this is, like you said, this is the time you're worried about right now, not the 10 times that you've talked to them in the past. Right. And I know that's, what Heather kind of reinforced, that is their goal and that is their training. That's really important. Let's see. So can you talk about, those conversations that 911 telecommunicators have with victims, and just how important and sensitive these situations are? So kind of just some of the nuances of those situations that telecommunicators need to understand when they're talking to someone that's a victim of abuse.
But I think it's important for a telecommunicator to understand that as much information as you can gather as quickly as you can is important, because if an abuser can get access to the phone and shut it off, then you've lost the link. But that safety app, if they're using that safety app, then we've got some really critical information already up front that may not have been collected if it had gotten shut off previously. So it allows us to gather more information more quickly. And I think that, sometimes the background information, like was alluded to a couple different times with other speakers, is that, are there kids in the house? What's the state of the condition of those other people, or are they in a public place? Are there other people that can be heard, so that maybe once the law enforcement gets there, the telecommunicator can inform them that it sounded like there was someone else in that space for a moment. I think that it just the critical gathering of information, and the listening to what's not being said, the listening to, this is a voice activated app as well. So they may not even have the phone in their hand when they activate the app. And so it's just recording background information. And that can be really helpful. Did the perpetrator say anything? What kinds of things are happening that could be signs of an escalation? So that's information that you could get to a first responder who's going to be at that door pretty quickly. It sounds like it's getting worse. It sounds like things are escalating quickly, that kind of thing. So helpful information just in terms of what the response will be, because our goal is everybody gets out of this alive, everybody. So the more information that we can gather, and the more information that's on that safety app to help us get to that goal is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And something you said earlier kind of is important to repeat, the idea that an abuser will go to any lengths, to keep the control that they have over their partner. And I think, looking at the situations that might arise where the caller on the other end is being abused, I think a 911 telecommunicator can kind of throw logic out the window almost. Is that a kind of an accurate statement that a normal person would not do some of the things that an abuser is going to do, and kind of be expecting anything?
Yeah, I have, over the course of the years I've done this work, been absolutely amazed at the creative energy that abusers put into maintaining control. They will do anything. They will take on any system. They will manipulate any opportunity, whether it's friends or family or other institute, whether it's the work environment that the victim goes to. They will take every step they can to ensure that they're not successful in getting away. And so you can't think about this as this is just somebody who's angry or upset. This is somebody who has a committed obsession with making sure that they stay in control, and they will use every method up to and including homicide to keep that control.
Yeah, that's a really important point, that it's not just someone that's mad and will eventually cool down, because it's likely to only continue to escalate. And I know next time when we kind of focus in on the law enforcement response, we can talk more about, that change in the person's demeanor from, what you may have heard on the 911 call could be a completely different person by the time that law enforcement shows up. So there's just so many different dynamics that I think are really important to discuss. With that, let's go ahead and we'll bring everyone back on, and I'm going to pull up the Q&A questions that have been coming in, and let's see if we can answer a few of these live today. So welcome everyone back. All right, and thank you to Rachel and Hannah on the domesticshelters.org team for monitoring the chat and getting all these questions together. So let's start off with one for Heather. So how do we know if our local 911 telecommunicators are able to use the safety card technology? And thank you so much for joining us, Melissa, as well. I think you could probably answer this as well. Yeah, Heather, do you want to start off, or?
Yeah, I didn't know if Melissa wanted to take it, or are you okay?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So how do we know? So how does people on this call know if their local 911 telecommunicator has access to that safety card information?
So it's a technology answer. So we are integrated with Rapid SOS, and Rapid SOS is in 5,200 of the 6,100 911 centers. Okay. And that is first and foremost an education piece for our team. We ask all of our folks to say, do you turn on the Rapid SOS portal? Okay. So we know for a fact that most of the 911 centers do turn on that Rapid SOS portal, because it is a vital need for them to be able to enable almost every single one of the location accuracy technology enabled apps out there. Rapid SOS is the #1 provider today for the 911 centers. And Heather can speak to that. John Jackson can speak to that on the phone here. And that's why we chose them. They're a wonderful partner in the 911 centers. So that's the first answer to that. The second answer to that is that in 3 months' time, we will be in all the 911 centers again. So we can provide you a map of the places that we will be not servicing here for the next 3 months. Okay.
Fantastic. And we did share that contact information, but we'll make sure that that is also in the follow-up email as well. There's a phone number and an email address where you can reach out to Melissa and the team at Bodyguard. Heather, anything to add to that answer? Otherwise,
Rapid SOS is a huge partner in the 911 world. We do rely on them a lot with a lot of data sharing that can come across that portal. And so seeing the link being available for the safety card data to display to the telecommunicators is a huge benefit, especially in those calls where there may not be communications or the person may not be able to speak. at least we know who this is subscribed to or who's trying to make the call to 911. And if they have any safety card data of protection order or who I'm afraid of, at least it gives us information to pass on to our responders who are going to be approaching that scene.
Awesome. Thank you. And the next question is also for Heather, and something that I kind of jotted down that I was hoping we could touch on, which is so often, domestic violence offenders interfere with 911 calls. So the victim has a very short time to speak, if any time at all. But what is the most important piece of information that a caller should share, if they're in crisis and they're reaching out to 911?
Location. If the technology is not there to support that, we are crippled in what we're able to provide as far as a reasonable response time. We can send people to a latitude and longitude, but oftentimes it is not an accurate depiction of a location. And so officers may be, in the area is what they will say, in the area attempting to locate. So if they have no other way to communicate anything else, if we can get just a location, that is the first key element of support efforts that we can offer.
Right, because it's seemingly John, if maybe you could speak to this. So if that is all that you get from the 911 telecommunicator, what is your standard response then? Is it just, to go to the location and then start asking questions, or, what would be your response?
Well, we're going to take it from a little bit more of a cautious perspective, because information is what will drive the response. So we're going to probably wait for backup. We're probably going to ask some more questions. We may ask for the 911 technicians to prompt some questions, see if we can develop any kind of information. And then we may end up simply going to the door and knocking on it, or that might not be the best response, and we could wait and see what happens. It really just depends on what we have, but we do have a policy of sending officers to 911 hangups and 911 open lines, as we call them. So we're going to go check on those, but we're going to be very cautious.
Yeah. And Matthew, from your perspective, those kind of calls, is that kind of just a dead end for you if there's a call where there's an open line, or they're just saying, I'm at this address, I need help? Is that still helpful in the prosecution side of things?
Absolutely. Those calls can actually be very, very persuasive in court, and some of our best evidence. There's been some references that perpetrator might take over the conversation. Those calls tell the entire story that a jury needs to hear, that obviously there's an incident that's going on. The victim has been, taken out of that situation, whether or not it's just by control or something worse, by some type of act of violence. And the perpetrator then taking over that call tells the jury everything that they need to know about that perpetrator in that event. It also does so much to diminish his or her defenses later on. They might say that they weren't there. They might say that nothing happened. They might make a whole series of denials that are completely nullified by their participation on that call. Even a call that comes through and you're able to establish the location and their silence. Again, you're telling an entire story about the victim's inability to speak to the 911 operator and what brought them to make that call.
Wow, that's really powerful. And that very surprised to hear that answer. I would have assumed that it was just kind of a dead end, but I think that, we can kind of take that, and as advocates and as we're, responding to crisis situations, or even just working with victims of abuse, to be able to share that with them and say, calling 911 does not have to be a long conversation. Just the mere act of doing so can help in a prosecution. So I think that's really important information to pass along. Let's move on to some more questions. Let's see.
Ashley, while you're looking at another question, I do have to piggyback off of this for just a moment, because I noticed that someone had put in here about, does this application work anywhere with any center? That is one of the benefits of this. Rita and I actually had this conversation, doing prep work. And one of the benefits is, you are not confined to just one jurisdiction. So if I travel, if I'm going to visit a friend in Colorado or in Indiana, wherever I go, that safety car data is traveling with you. So if you're calling 911 using that application and that information is received in that jurisdiction of where you may be visiting, that would not have access to your local, data from your local emergency response center, that is information that is putting more power in the telecommunicators' hands with data to be able to be a little bit more familiar with who they're speaking with, what may be happening, if their medical card is filled out, if they have emergency contacts filled out, if it is a domestic violence, case, or even a mental health crisis. That's information that they would not have just doing traditional 911 calling.
Yeah, that's really important. That was something that, excuse me, I learned in the pre-call, was like this idea of if you're calling a different jurisdiction, that they have no idea about the 10 calls that you placed over the last year. So to be able to carry that information with you, no matter where you go, so important. Transitioning over to the ability to text 911. So someone asked, how has the ability to text 911 changed things for 911 telecommunicators? Do you see this becoming a nationwide standard soon?
Yeah, as long as technology is evolving and growing, texting to 911 is definitely available in many areas right now across the country. There are advantages and disadvantages to texting. When you're texting, the message that we like to portray with that is call if you can, text if you can't. We don't like to rely on text as a primary form of communicating or contacting 911 just because there are limitations with that. But if they can speak, if they can use the safety app, to make the notification, that is giving us more data than just a text, response.
Yeah. So this question is kind of for Heather and Rita. So just kind of describing the situation. So one area where we struggle from the 911 PSAP perspective is calls from shelters where the advocate is having an issue with a client on site. So for example, the advocate needs a disruptive client to leave. But at the same time, due to confidentiality, they can't give us the disruptive person's name that they are asking us to send the police to confront. So do either of you have experience with a situation similar to that, where there's that confidentiality aspect, and kind of how can domestic violence advocates best approach that?
Yeah, I'll speak to that just because that's a fellow colleague of mine. So hi, Christine. The reason we ask these questions from a PSAP perspective is because we're sending law enforcement into a situation that can become very, violent, or it could be aggressive, or it could escalate, that can create for dangerous situations, not only for the responder, but also for the advocates and the victim and the people who may be at these shelter locations. And I do understand about confidentiality, because we want to try to protect victim data as much as possible, especially when you have public records requests and things that are coming into 911 that may potentially release information that really we shouldn't be releasing from a victim perspective. But the reason we're asking the questions is because it allows us to look at that person to see if there's any outstanding warrants on the accuser or the perpetrator, or just trying to get a synopsis of what may be going on, so we can better inform law enforcement of what they're walking into. So Rita, you'll have to help on this side, because I think that is I didn't think about this until she brought it up in the chat here, or the Q&A here. So how can we support? How can we obtain enough information to give an appropriate response without violating that confidentiality?
I think it's a tricky situation, and when we worked in shelters, I did have to walk someone out the door, and they can be scary. People who are not who have other needs beyond what shelter from domestic violence is. And I think that over the years, domestic violence shelters have had to deal with more and more victims of domestic violence who had other kinds of issues, like alcohol or substance addictions or mental health issues. And so, the field has tried to get better informed and training people how to deal with those with mental health issues. If they are disruptive to the point where you feel like they're dangerous, then I think it's important to share as much information as possible with law enforcement, so that everybody is safe, and that there's a response that happens that can help this person become better supported in an environment where they get better control of what's happening with them, and then the shelter can provide information and resources potentially to that other outlet that they may go to. But you do have to give law enforcement, I think, enough information to protect everyone else in the shelter. So so whatever your state laws are, you need to follow those. But I think it's important that we do what we can to make sure that victims get what they need, even if they are creating problems within shelter, that they're creating those problems for a reason, and we need to respond to those reasons as well as their safety issues.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Leah. It's really great information. A quick question, or this one should be a kind of a yes or no answer, but do 911 calls show up on a phone bill? So this is obviously an issue with people who are trying to maintain, a level of confidentiality from their partner that they, called 911.
Yeah, and every state, again, like Rita was saying, you have to follow your state, policies, procedures, and general statutes. But I know for us, there are certain things we can release and certain things we cannot release when it comes to public records requests. Yes, all calls that are transactioned through a 911 call center show up in some shape, form, or fashion as a data trail. They do, but due to general statute, we don't always have the public release of releasing the caller name or phone number on public record requests. So yes, it will show up, but based on the public record request of what's being asked, it may be determined whether that's redacted information or not.
I'm going to speak to the eBodyguard side. If you use the eBodyguard app, it will not show up through us.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of, I don't think 911 is a call that would normally show up on a phone bill. I think phone bills generally show your local service charge and then whatever long distance calls are made. And so in terms of your own phone, though, your phone has a retention process whereby calls that you're made are retained in your phone. And so you need to educate yourself about how you erase phone numbers from your phone. Under the menu in your phone app, you can erase them, and then I think to make sure there's not a trash can, and you empty the trash can. And that way, at least from the phone's perspective, there's no way to see who was called previously on that particular phone system. So it's another way to keep your abuser a little bit less informed about what you're doing during the day.
Yeah. Very good. Question for Matthew and John. So what can we give, talk, tell, or show law enforcement to demonstrate that the abuser is making false claims about the mental health of a victim as a way to make law enforcement doubt the victim? So, one example is, what happened with Gabby Petito, with her boyfriend was able to kind of persuade the law enforcement officers into thinking that, she was the primary aggressor. But could you maybe talk about, how a victim or survivor should approach the situation when they're interacting with law enforcement?
Well, if I can start, Matt, what I'll say is, and I was going to point to Gabby Petito, is it is difficult because law enforcement's coming into the situation and doesn't really know. So what they can best present are the facts, the what has happened, explain in a way that is easily understood to show what has gone on. I have asked domestic violence victims to journal things, and that's become important in helping law enforcement understand what's happened, not just that day, but in the past. But what people have to understand is law enforcement can only deal with facts that they can prove and articulate into a police report. They can't make guesses and they can't suppose. And what you would think sometimes might be common sense is difficult to prove. And it's facts and data that allows law enforcement to make a decision against the law to determine if there's probable cause for arrest, reasonable suspicion to intervene, and get to the outcome that's best for all. But it really boils down to what we can prove and substantiate. And then we move that over to the courts in the form of a police report. And it can seem a little bit inhumane, but ultimately we have to deal with what's in front of us.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Matthew?
Yeah, what I would say is that just to be as honest and as raw as possible. And hopefully the dust settles on that honesty. And as Rita's already said, perpetrators are brilliant at manipulating people, victims, police officers, and situations. And you just have to do the impossible, particularly in that moment of trauma and that moment of abuse, of just trying to stay focused, not on the perpetrator's manipulation, but on providing law enforcement with the information that they need to make the right decision in the moment. And I know that that's an impossible task at times for victims in that moment, but to stay focused on providing good, solid, honest information, and sometimes information that's very challenging or hard to talk about, whether it's sexual abuse or there's drugs or alcohol involved. Giving those officers everything that they need to make the right decision is critical.
Yeah, really important. The question that I believe has been asked quite a bit, so it kind of reroutes us to talking more about eBodyguard, which is a great conversation to have in this context. If a person utilizes the safety app, so eBodyguard, how is their use of the app kept confidential from the perpetrator? So is the app hidden from prying eyes of their abuser? What if the abuser has control over their phone or phone use? Melissa, could you start by answering this one?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for everyone and all the hard work you do every day, tireless work and protecting victims. A couple of things we have done is we have made the app free so that it does not show up on a bank account. We have hidden it and given the option to hide behind a waterfall. And then you can hide it behind folders in both the Android and the Apple iPhone. And so if you go to the app settings, there is a way to change the app icon, okay, here. And then that would become the waterfall right there. The confidentiality then piece was what I was getting to, is that there's no trace that they would call 911 at all when they actually call 911 through the app. So all of those are the ways that we worked with Rita and other experts on building this app. Does that address the question, Ashley?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's important to understand. Yeah, there's kind of that visual cover, but then also, we all know that data is hidden in other places. So to know that there's no way that they know that the app has actually been downloaded is helpful as well. So thank you for that. Question for Heather. So one challenge that we see working with immigration and refugee survivors is the language barriers. So what are some tips that you have for those needing help that speak little or no English?
Well, I don't really have a tip, but I do have resources. Many 911 centers, across the country use a language line service of support because there's no way you're going to have a multi-bilingual person that can speak every language that may come in from a call to 911. So we do have language line services that are available to telecommunicators, where we can have an interpreter on the line to identify what dialect or what language, if we don't already know, and they will help us to translate what the need is to ensure that we're sending the appropriate response. We also have that extension to our law enforcement. So if law enforcement is out on a traffic stop or an emergency and there's a language barrier there, we can extend that service through telephone for our law enforcement to engage in that type of interpretation as well.
Fantastic. Great to know. One question that I had jotted down, and this I think would be a great question for Heather to answer, and then if anyone has anything to chime in on, but what are kind of some factors that can affect the way that a 911 telecommunicator is responding? So what are kind of those external things that are going on outside of that individual call that could kind of affect their response, and what kind of things are they trained maybe to avoid being affected by?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, in a PSAP operation, there are tons of distractions because you are taking calls, you have other phones ringing, you have radio communications, background noises. There's so many things that can distract in a moment. When we train telecommunicators in the call taking process, we train them to focus on the need, not the behavior of how someone is asking for help or for the service, to just hone in on just acknowledging the emotion, acknowledging the person, seeing the person, and then getting the information that we need, what we call our 5 W's, the where, what, when, who, and weapons. And then from there is simply just trying to focus on the call at hand to ensure that we're getting the appropriate information to ensure a safe response. Like, you know, John said earlier, we do have open lines and hangups that come in, and officers have a different approach to how they would go in unknown situations, more so than having some information. Telecommunicators are also trained to listen for background noises. You know, and sometimes you have silent calls, you have nothing to go on, but sometimes you have a lot of background noise that you can make a distinction whether a person is in distress, whether there is any type of violent act or activity based on what you're hearing in the background. And that information can be relayed to law enforcement. So at least they know they're going into a situation that could be an assault or disturbance or domestic or medical emergency for that matter. So yeah, I hope that answered, you know, your question there.
Yeah. And also, I mean, one other thing is more like environmental factors too. So, I mean, how many calls they've assumed that they've answered that day and, you know, what the nature of those calls. So if they've answered 2 back-to-back, you know, child issue, you know, issues where a child was being injured, I'm assuming that that kind of affects them. You know, you would, is as much as they'd like to not to, I'm sure it affects the way that they approach the next call.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things in working in telecommunications is, you know, when people are here and they're training in the environment, they know that they can go from cold to hot in any second based on the next call. And what I mean by that is you may be actually assisting a person with a non-emergency need who is calling 911, and you have to educate and then process through that call. And then you could hang up the phone from that incident and turn right around and answer a call where there's an active shooter or there's a multi wreck with multiple victims that will require a larger jurisdictional response. Officer safety, you could be taking a non-emergency call, and an officer, based on your relationship of working with an officer, you can tell when they're in distress based on how they communicate over the radio system. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be able to still assess the call that you're working, but also give aid and support to that responder who may be in distress, who's communicating by radio communications. So yeah, it's a roller coaster ride sometimes, but we do offer breaks. We do offer quiet spaces where telecommunicators can step away from the noise and from the distraction and just kind of have a moment of silence. If it is something that we see that is more traumatic for the individual, then we may have to make arrangements for them to step away from the work for the remainder of the shift, such as if we had an officer in the line of duty death or an assault or something that took place. Naturally, you would not expect for the person to be able to sit there after they have assisted under that traumatic event to continue throughout the shift. So it's a case-by-case basis based on the person and based on what's happening in hand.
Yeah, that's great to know that there are those kind of resources to help and things in place to help them kind of recover. Because I can only imagine the repeat trauma over and over again of like you said, they're the person that's on the other end of the line in mm-hmm. the most darkest hour of many people's lives. So, you know, to kind of not take that trauma in and sit with it, to have a way to process it.
Yeah, so and many communities too, well, not communities, but communication centers. And many communication centers, they have internal resources of what we call an employee assistance program, or, you know, critical incident stress debriefing. So just depending on what the situation of the incident involved is and what the telecommunicators' involvement is will determine how much, you know, mental health and support that individual will get. Sometimes you come in here and you have to decompartmentalize, you know, what's going on on shifts because you're choosing an environment where you know you're going to deal with trauma, you're going to deal with other people's trauma, you're going to deal with things that you wouldn't see on a day-to-day basis walking a normal, you know, kind of profession of a different, you know, era. But when you're here, you know, you're going to be dealing with certain things. And so for us to be proactive in that approach is to ensure that we have the mental health support and wellness support for telecommunicators so they can get what they need to continue in this career.
Yeah, very good. So this question, probably leading off with Heather again, but and I think maybe Matthew and Rita and even John might have something to add to it. So if someone is in the address confidentiality program, what name should they give to the dispatcher so their real name isn't associated with an incident, the address or on the CAD call records, excuse me. This is something that victims worry about when calling for help because they fear that if the call is subpoenaed, the offender will know their confidential address.
Just from the PSAP perspective, we train telecommunicators not to judge the truthfulness of a caller. So really, we have no way of knowing really what the person's name is. One of our questions in the 5Ws is the who, right? And so if they tell me they're John Doe, that's all I have to go on because there's a lot of information that we don't get with wireless cell phone calls that are coming into centers. Landline is a little different, but even though with landline telephones where it may display a name, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the name of the person you're speaking to. It could be the name that the phone is registered to. It just depends on the situation at hand to how that can be used. But I do know that within our call center that we do have victim, rights and protection with that as far as like what if they say they want to be anonymous and our data is displaying information, we omit this information. So it's not even displayed on like the public records or like the data that's going out to the public.
Very good. Matthew, can you speak to that too? Because obviously you're going to handle that evidence at some point. How do you make sure that someone who needs their new address to be confidential, that information stays confidential?
Well, I can't speak to first responders in those protocols, so I would defer to John Jackson on that. However, from our perspective, once we receive that information, we can, depending upon what the situation is, we can certainly try to redact that information in our file. Of course, we have to presume that we're going to give the defense everything. So it's just really a case by case analysis. However, what I would say is that is tremendous evidence again, right? Even conflicting information, while maybe problematic in a prosecution, tells a story. It tells a story of abuse. It tells a story of fear, of control, and just even the steps that a victim had to take in advance to try to manage that situation as they're perhaps trying to extricate themselves from this relationship that they can't get out of. That they're taking steps. They're planning for their next abuse or for their next time that they have to call the police. So again, even, I don't want to call it bad information, even incorrect information can be powerful in the courtroom.
Right. Just basically highlighting the fact that they had to have a confidential address says something about the case and kind of the circumstances.
Exactly. And so that fact alone is actually perhaps one of our best pieces of evidence. And depending upon the situation, we would want to provide that, whatever that looks like at some point in a prosecution. But obviously we need to be mindful of first, safety first, and then making sure that we're not divulging something that shouldn't, not just safety for our victim, but safety for children involved, safety for other family or friends. So we would be mindful of that together, balancing that with our ethical obligations to provide discovery to the defense.
Great information. John, anything to add to that in terms of the law enforcement response and making sure that address stays confidential?
I think that Matthew's done a great job of talking to it, and there's a bit of complexity, not just with the ethical part, but the legal part. So if you choose and want to be anonymous in what you say or what you do, I would just say that just ask and say you'd rather be anonymous. That's better than giving your name and then asking law enforcement to not comply with an open records request or to hold something confidential when we really legally can't. So it gets into a bit of legal complexities we don't need to get into today, that some of these people are pretty smart, cunning, know the system, know their way around, and they will file open records requests. And we are then bound by law to comply and give that information. And that shouldn't scare people. It should just make them aware that there are rules that we have to follow that are called laws that we will follow unless we know there is a compelling reason that violates the public interest or public safety to degrees. We just have to be very careful. And then, as Matt has really explained, it all becomes discoverable. And it's what law enforcement then provides to the DA's office for prosecution. which is a part of the case. And those people's attorneys are going to know.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually, I think one thing that might be helpful for advocates to know is that if there is a way to let victims know if they're going into the address confidentiality process, is to put every possible public record they have on that address. So the address being usually the Attorney General's office or something. That's where the protective, depending on what state you're in, that's what the protective address is. If you have, even if you're going to pay your phone bill by internet, the whatever address of record you have for anything that you do once you leave that perpetrator, is if you can do anything to put the address of record as being that confidential address, then that's the only address that's going to be released on you. And the Attorney General's office or the state agency that does that system for DV victims will not release that other address. So I think that's one strategy, is just to make sure that they understand using it for everything they possibly can use it for is the most helpful thing in terms of possible discovery later.
Yeah, that's great to know. So we have about 5 minutes left here, and there are some questions that come in that are maybe a little more targeted towards law enforcement or the prosecution side of things. So I'm going to hold on to those questions for future webinars because, like I said, it's a series. So today we're focusing on the 911 response, and then we'll focus on law enforcement and prosecution as well. So if I don't answer your question, we'll hold on to that and make sure we focus on it in future webinars. But one question I wanted to shift over to for Melissa. So how are you informing domestic violence victims that eBodyguard exists? And it sounds like such a great resource. Obviously, we agree with that 100%.
We have several tracks of communication. One is right here on our domesticshelters.org launch. Thank you so much, Ashley and Rita.
Yeah.
And we also are going to be launching through a national campaign with domestic shelters through each of you all and your 3,000 advocacies. And then we have a huge launch through Rapid SOS and those communications. And we are personally reaching out through our law enforcement. And so this is how we're getting the word out.
Yeah, the other thing I think is important is I saw somewhere on the chat that someone was interested in how do we get this in our area. If you think this would be helpful to your service provision, you can reach out to us at eBodyguard, and we'll definitely do training or conversations with your local law enforcement or PSAP to help them understand what this resource is and how it can be helpful in terms of their responders. And then the other part of the platform, which is the virtual highway that actually protects the data that gets entered and makes things much more possible in terms of prosecution later. But reach out and let us know that you might be interested in your area, because we're looking to get this as broad as we can. So if you think your system or your community is interested in this, then let us know. We'll definitely start to reach out and educate on a perspective that way.
That's awesome.
Thanks, Rita.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of part of the communication that will be coming soon, is that we'll introduce some more information via email, remind everyone of those contact information pieces, either the phone number or email address, that way people can connect and start that conversation as well. So let's go ahead and see. There's one more question coming in. I'm going to read through it really quick. It's a little long. So it says it's for everyone. So you mentioned police responding to 911 open line and hang up calls. Can any members of the panel speak to the difference in varied responses depending on the jurisdiction and policies, particular to each department, regarding types of calls officers will or will not respond to? So would this be a different incident code or description of each incoming 911 call? And he or she included an example, which is officers will respond on location to check well-being of an individual in one jurisdiction, if someone calls with the 911 with this request. However, it seems like officers in neighboring jurisdictions will not. So I think the question is kind of summarizing down to this idea of how and what factors come into play in terms of when an officer will respond to a a hang up call or a silent call? Is it specific to each jurisdiction, or is there some other factor that comes into play? I don't know if John or Heather, which if you could weigh in on this.
Yeah, I can speak from the PSAP side. I work for a consolidated center, so we have 7 law enforcement agencies that we dispatch for. Well, naturally, we're not going to respond 7 different ways based on each department's request. So what we do is we have a law enforcement department head meeting, and we bring all this to the topic of conversation. For 911 open lines, how are we going to respond to these? For 911 hangups, how are we going to respond to these? For welfare checks, for each complaint type that we may get a call for, how are we going to be unified in our dispatch protocol, and how are the officers going to respond? That way it puts us all on the same page. So this is not a like a cookie cutter approach to say just because one county does it this way that another county is going to do it the same. There are differences in operations dependent on location, rural counties versus larger counties, number of personnel. There's so many variances in this that can create for maybe why there are different approaches or responses per jurisdiction.
Really great. John, anything to add to that before we wrap up?
Yeah, very simply, this boils down to agency policy. And as Heather has explained it, consolidated centers deal with multiple agencies, and they need to have a coordinated policy on how they're going to respond. But let me be very clear. To get to the 911 system, somebody has to call 911. Somebody has to push 911. And it's our job to figure out why. Now, that can vary from a young child who just decides to test the system and see if it works to someone who needs help and has dialed 911 and threw their phone underneath the pillow so they could gather whatever was going to happen next. But our job and our role in this is to prevent anything of crisis from happening or getting worse. And so we have a policy that we are going to respond to hang up calls to see if it is a kid that's doing it to have fun. And if that's the case, it's a great opportunity to build a relationship and help a child understand what they've done. I've been to hundreds of those calls and talked to many, many kids. If it is in fact an open line where you're not hearing anything back, we know that somebody has to call 911 and somebody's on the other line, and we're going to not stop until we figure out why that open line happened. That's just our departmental policy. That's what we feel is the best way to approach it. And that probably means us going to the home or staging some calls back. We can force some things in, but we're going to try and figure out why that open line exists and not just go, oh, it's nothing, let's move on.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thank you everyone so much for being a part of this panel today. I'll echo some of the comments in the chat right now. Everyone's saying thank you and just sharing how important this information was. So it's really important to have these conversations. So thanks for everyone who tuned in as well. And just a quick reminder that this webinar was recorded, and we'll have a transcript, certificate of attendance, and any shared resources that we mentioned. We'll email that out within a week of today. Again, if you're a call-in listener, please email info@domesticshelters.org just to let us know that you were here today, and we'll include you on our email distribution list. But with that, we'll go ahead and conclude today's presentation. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.